There are over 500 million Buddhists in the world, hundreds of millions more who have read his words, bought statues of him, hung his quotes on their walls. His face is one of the most reproduced images in human history, and we have almost no idea who he actually was, not because the records were lost, not because historians stopped looking, but because the story that survived, the sheltered prince, the miraculous awakening, the perfectly wise teacher, was written by people who needed it to be that story, who had something to gain from it being that story. The closer you look at the historical record, the more the golden statue starts to crack. And what's underneath is not less interesting. It's considerably more. So, who actually was the Buddha? Let's find out. The story you have been told, the sheltered prince, the golden palace, the father engineering a life without suffering, is almost certainly fiction, constructed after the fact by people who needed their founder to have a suitably dramatic origin story. Here is what scholars actually know about Siddhartha Gautama's background. His father was a leader within the Shakya clan of what is now southern Nepal. But the Shakyas did not have a king. They were governed by something closer to a republican oligarchy, a council of influential families who met and voted. His father wasn't a monarch. He was, roughly speaking, a local politician, a prominent one, perhaps. But the palace? The 3 seasonal estates? The walls, so high that death itself couldn't climb them? Embellishment, probably added by later devotees who felt that a man of such spiritual stature must have had proportionally spectacular circumstances to renounce. The prince framing wasn't biography, it was marketing, designed to make the renunciation as dramatic as possible. Even his dates are disputed. The traditional timeline places his birth around 560 BCE. Modern scholars push that closer to 480 or even 450 BCE, partly based on archaeological evidence, partly because early Buddhist communities had strong institutional incentives to push the birth date further back. The older your founder, the more legitimate your tradition. Everyone was playing that game. Archaeologists excavating the site, traditionally identified as Kapilavastu, the Buddha's hometown, found material that did not date to the supposed period of his childhood. The dispute over where he actually grew up has never been resolved. The hometown of one of history's most famous people may be, quite literally, unknown. And then there is the most destabilizing possibility of all, that we know essentially nothing. Scholar David Drews has argued carefully and at length that despite more than 2 centuries of intense academic effort, historians have failed to establish a single concrete biographical fact about the historical Buddha that can be verified independently. The words, the deeds, the key moments, all of it is filtered through texts written centuries after his death by institutions with a powerful stake in what those texts said. This does not mean he didn't exist. Most historians believe he did. It means that the story we tell about him is a story shaped by power, politics, and the very human need to make meaning from a remarkable life. Whatever the precise contours of Siddhartha's early life, the awakening story that follows it has the unmistakable texture of human struggle, years of dead ends, physical ruin, and ideological restlessness. That part rings true precisely because it is so inglorious. He was not a man visited by sudden divine revelation. He was a man who tried everything and failed repeatedly before finding something that worked. But the episode that modern accounts almost universally omit, or mention only briefly before moving on, is what happened when the women came knocking. After his awakening, as his community grew and his reputation spread, his own stepmother Pajapati came to him with a request. She had raised him after his mother died in childbirth. She had been a second mother to him in every meaningful sense. She asked to join the monastic order, to become a fully ordained practitioner. He said no. She asked again. He said no again. She shaved her head, put on yellow robes, and followed him with a large group of other women traveling on foot, arriving with bleeding, blistered feet at his next stop. A public act of determined, dignified protest. He said no a third time. His attendant Ananda had to argue him into it. The most enlightened man in the world needed to be lobbied to admit women into his own community. He eventually relented, but only after his attendant Ananda explicitly argued the case. Were women not equally capable of awakening? The Buddha conceded that yes, they were, and so nuns were permitted, but under a framework that permanently subordinated them to the male order. A nun of 50 years standing was required to defer to a monk who had been ordained that morning, and the Buddha reportedly told Ananda that admitting women would cut the lifespan of his teachings in half, from 1,000 years to 500. How do we read this? The generous interpretation is cultural pragmatism. He was operating within a society that would have rejected an egalitarian monastic community outright, and he was making calculated compromises to preserve the movement. The less generous interpretation is that even awakening has its blind spots. That 2.5 millennia before the conversation became common, the most spiritually celebrated man of his age held views about women that his own stated philosophy should have precluded. The order of nuns Pajapati founded, the Bhikkhuni Sangha, eventually died out in many Theravada countries due to lack of proper ordination lineages. Efforts to revive it in the 20th and 21st centuries have been fiercely opposed by conservative male monastic establishments, often citing the very hesitation the Buddha originally showed as justification. Then there was Devadatta. Every religion needs its traitor, and Buddhism found one in Siddhartha's cousin, who also happened to be the brother of his wife, making him both cousin and brother-in-law. The canonical Buddhist texts portray him as perhaps the darkest figure in the entire tradition. Jealous, power-hungry, politically scheming, and ultimately damned. He sent assassins. He rolled a boulder down a hill at the Buddha. He released a drunk war elephant into his path. Quite the rap sheet, but here is what the same texts also record, somewhat inconveniently. Devadatta's actual doctrinal proposals were stricter asceticism, vegetarianism, and a refusal to accept gifts from wealthy laypeople. He thought the community had grown comfortable, too close to power, too willing to accept royal patronage and the compromises that came with it. He may not have been wrong. The institution that wrote the history also decided who was the villain. That should at least give us pause. The Buddha rejected Devadatta's proposals. A schism followed. The texts then describe the murderous campaign, a campaign that reads like the kind of story an institution tells about someone who challenged its authority and lost. The assassination attempts are almost cartoonishly incompetent. The condemnation is absolute, totalizing, permanent. He is cast as one of the few figures in Buddhist cosmology guaranteed to go to hell. His rival community survived. It was documented by the Chinese pilgrim Xuanzang in the 7th century CE. More than 1,000 years after Devadatta's supposed treachery, people were still following his rules, which means either that his followers were fanatically devoted to a proven monster, or that the monster narrative was something else, a theological smear, crafted to discredit a man whose alternative vision of what Buddhism should be was close enough to the mainstream to pose a genuine threat. We will never know. The winners wrote the sutras. Let's revisit his reluctance on the women. Allow Devadatta some complexity. What remains is not a diminished figure, it is a more believable one. A man who genuinely found something profound, who built something remarkable, and who still carried into his enlightened life the weight of his culture, his gender, his politics, and his institutional interests. He was a human being. The golden statues, the incense, the unbroken serenity, all of it was built by people who needed their founder to be beyond contradiction. But the contradictions are exactly what makes the history so interesting. A perfect teacher teaches you nothing about what it means to be imperfect. A teacher who struggled, who stalled, who made concessions he perhaps shouldn't have, who may have been misrepresented almost from the moment of his death, that teacher has something harder and more useful to offer. We made him gold because gold doesn't age and doesn't argue and doesn't turn women away 3 times before relenting. The actual man was considerably more interesting. He died at 80 of food poisoning, probably from bad mushrooms, in a small town that most people couldn't find on a map. His last recorded words were an instruction to keep working, that no one, not even him, had handed anyone a shortcut. He said it simply. Then he died. That, at least, has the ring of truth.